All the stories, images, and hollows I had studied had not done it a modicum of justice. The eye of God was magnificent. Its white iris of nuclear fire burned in the void, a bulwark against the blackness. Clouds of various shades swam in the sclera, circled by a halo of cool indigo that was interspersed with chunks of grey rock the size of space stations. At the centre blazed the icy people of prodigious density, a sphere with a gravitational pull so strong that I would have been converted into a pate an atom thick had I somehow managed to find my way onto the surface. The entire structure came together to form something that transcended its components, something that brought it to life. As stupid as it sounds, intelligence seemed to emanate from it, maybe even sentience. "Hey Prof, if you're done drooling on the glass, can you move out of the way so we can take a look?" I turned around startled and peeled myself off the shuttle's front view screen. The young man with dark wavy hair in the bespoke Aloe suit glared at me. Propped on his lap was a sketchpad with a half-finished drawing of the Eye of God. "My apologies," I stammered, toggled off the telescopic function of my Kuiper pocket multiscope and floated back to my seat. The man grunted in acknowledgement and made a point of returning to his sketch. The slender blonde beside him turned to me and gave me an apologetic smile. "Sorry, I can't take him anywhere," she said, a sparkle of mirth in her light blue eyes. "It was my fault," I said, heat in my cheeks. "I got carried away." She gave a dismissive wave, then nodded to the front view screen. "You here to sightsee too?" "Sort of. I'm an astrometeorologist." "A what?" "Someone who studies extraplanetary weather phenomena." "That's a real job?" I laughed. "Yes, though some of my colleagues in the natural sciences department would disagree." "So what kind of extraplanetary weather phenomena are you here to study?" she asked, grinning as she waved her arms about to convey the weird and abstract. The man beside her gave her a disapproving glance, but she didn't notice. "The lightning," I said. "Lightning in space?" she said, incredulity clear in her voice. "Well, not in a vacuum, but that isn't the case here. The white dwarf core is enveloped in a special type of planetary nebula that was left behind after the collapse of the original star. It acts as a proto-atmosphere and enables cloud formation. The mystery is how that proto-atmosphere is capable of producing storms, let alone lightning." She raised a perfectly sculpted eyebrow. "Are they dangerous?" I gave her a reassuring smile. "As long as you stay inside the hotel, you'll be fine." The shuttle reached a mini plateau and touched down on the landing yard adjacent the hotel. The building itself featured thick industrial walls and only a few windows. While this wasn't ideal for a relaxing stay, it did make sense given its past as a research base. We were greeted by a middle-aged woman with a purple shawl who stood next to an enormous man with a sparse head of hair and worker's overalls. Around her neck hung a stout gold cross of the Neocostal Church, though this one had been modified to include a large pearl at its center. "Welcome to the Ophanim," the woman said, with a bright smile. "My name is Martha, and this is my husband, Robert. We're glad to have guests this time of year. There are a few house rules, but we can go over them later. First, let me check if everyone is here." "Sarah Richards?" "Here," the blonde woman said. Martha nodded. "Cornelius Regis?" The man raised his hand. "And lastly, Ulysses Linton?" "That would be me," I said, with a chuckle. "Perfect. The most important thing is that you don't step outside the perimeter of the hotel. That's where the bio and anti-grav fields stop, so don't leave unless you want to float off, suffocate, and freeze to death." She turned and beckoned to us. "Please follow me inside and I will show you around. Bert will take your bags." The interior of the hotel was an incongruent hybrid of a space station and a 20th century home. Each room we visited featured faux wood paneling and drab wallpaper over the space-grade steel. Even the plasma bulbs were disguised as archaic candles, or chandeliers and burned a dim orange that mimicked flame. Luckily, the tour finished on the rooftop where the hideous clash of styles was absent. Instead, we were treated to the cosmos. Thousands of stars twinkled in the backdrop while the eye of God peered down at us with its unblinking gaze. "Anyone here have any questions before we head back to our rooms?" Martha said. "Can we get some chairs and stay up here? The view's amazing," Sarah said. Martha gave an uneasy smile and drew her shawl closer to her body. She gave a furtive glance up to the eye of God, then turned back to us. "It's best we don't. The storms have gotten much more intense recently and even damaged our shuttle when Bert flew back from an errand. An engineer was meant to come out here yesterday, but no one turned up." "Oh, okay," Sarah said, dejected. Cornelius frowned. "Surely we can sit in the courtyard, though." "That shouldn't be a problem," Martha said, though the nervous smile didn't leave her face. "Sorry, I need to stay up here to set up my equipment," I said. Martha tensed. "Equipment for what exactly?" "To get readings of the storm you mentioned, specifically the lightning." Martha frowned. "No, that will not be possible." My mouth hung agape for a few seconds before I regained my composure. "I came here for the express purpose of collecting data on the storms. They almost never reach this asteroid because we are orbiting orthogonal to the elliptical plane. This is a once-in-a-decade opportunity. If I come back with nothing, the university's resources will have gone down the drain and they will never fund anything like this again. I'm sorry, Mr. Linton, but the eye of God is sacred. It and its mysteries are to be treated with reverence, not besmirched by those who poke and prod." "Reverence? It's a dead star, not a temple." Martha's frown deepened into a scowl. "This is what I mean. You people are in such a rush to uncover the secrets of our Lord that you never pause to think if you should. Some things are reserved for Him and Him alone. Now let's make our way back down," she said, and brushed past me to the door. I stood there, crushed by the weight of her words. Without the data, my research paper would be a collection of fanciful hypotheses and nothing more. Thus, my whole lab could be shut down after such exorbitant fees yielded naught. "These things are meant to be admired, not understood," Cornelius said, with a pat on my shoulder as he walked past. As if lit by fuse, the urge to punch him grew until it became unbearable. I turned to follow him, but before I could take a step, Sarah gave me a brief squeeze of my arm and a sympathetic smile. "Don't worry," she said. "It'll be okay." The anger faded, but the rest of the cocktail of emotions still churned in my gut. "Maybe," I said, my voice sullen. It was 4 nights later when I found myself back on the rooftop, setting up the ionic pole start. Above, the storm raged, twice as fierce as when it had picked up 3 nights ago. Great purple clouds swam around the eye like jellyfish caught in a whirlpool. Every few seconds, the tendrils of superheated plasma shot out to strike each other, producing a faint rumble in the proto-atmosphere. "You couldn't help yourself, could you?" a voice said behind me. The muscles in my body contracted as if they'd been struck by the lightning above. I spun around, and the tension eased. It was Sarah in a red silk nightgown with a heavy blanket draped over her shoulders. "What are you doing here?" I hissed. She closed the exit door behind her and walked over. "Sunbathing, same as you." I turned back to the ionic pole star and gave it one final inspection. "You should go. There's no sense in us both getting into trouble." "Well, I can't sleep and this looks like fun," she said, and walked over to lean against the rail beside me. "It isn't," I said. "I'm here to collect adequate readings while I still can." She groaned. "And here I thought you'd be better than Cornelius. He's so absorbed in his stupid sketches that he won't talk to anyone. Claims it interrupts his creative flow." I opened my mouth to speak, then caught myself. I slotted the dart into the collapsible probe cannon and stood up. The spool of silver nanowire braid was anchored to the discharge cube. All there was left to do was to fire. You had all this in your suitcase? She asked. Suitcases, I corrected. Oh, Robert must have really loved you that day, she laughed, her perfect teeth gleaming in the silvery light. I smiled, hesitated, then took the remote out of my pocket and offered it to her. Care to do the honours? She stared at me and the remote wide-eyed, then took it from me as if it were a live grenade. What do I do? Everything has been set up and calibrated. All you need to do is press the red button. Oh, she said, in a shaky voice, and after a brief pause, she tapped it. There was a muted bang, and the ionic pulse dart shot into the air, tens of meters up before I could even blink. The kilometers of nanowire braid unwound and ascended after the probe, a one-dimensional dragon in pursuit of its prey. They hurtled towards a dense cluster of clouds that looked like a cataract on the Eye of God. So, the lightning is meant to hit your dart-looking thing? She said, head craned to the sky. The ionic pulse dart, yes. Won't that blow it up? No, the discharge cube will handle most of the energy. Dart is just bait. 2 minutes later, the nanowire braid was taut. Though the probe was not visible, I knew it had deployed its microthrusters to counteract the whiplash tension from the wire. Did you see that? Sarah said, a hint of panic in her voice. See what? I said, turning back to her. That thing in the clouds. When the lightning flashed, there was a shadow. Of what? I don't know, she said, her voice rising. Her eyes were wide and she trembled beneath the blanket she clutched. I don't know, but it was big and it moved. No, squirmed. It was just a trick of. A titanic flash cut me off as a white bolt, tinged with a sickish green, came down from the black mass of clouds. It struck what must have been the dart, and everything went wrong. The lightning coursed down the nanowire braid, but leapt off at the last moment and stabbed into Sarah. I was left with the acrid smell of burnt flesh as she crumpled to the floor, lifeless. What did you do to her? Cornelius shouted and punched me in the face. I reeled back, tripped over the dining room chair, and crashed to the floor. Cornelius followed up with a sharp kick to the side, and I yelped as hot pain soared through my ribs. Bert! Martha yelled. Robert grabbed Cornelius by the scruff of his neck with one meaty hand and yanked him away. Unhand me, you stone-faced oaf, Cornelius shouted, though his struggles in the giant man's hold were futile. Stop, Robert intoned, more rumble than speech. I need to call my father now, Cornelius said. He'll have the bastard on an outer ring mining colony for the rest of his miserable life. Storms downed EM transmission, Robert said. I staggered to my feet. It was an accident. Martha glowered at me. This was no accident, Mr. Linton. I explicitly forbade you to conduct any experiments on the premises, especially relating to the eye. She pointed to Sarah, who lay motionless on the dining table. Now look what your work has wrought. I stared. The plasma bulbs from the chandelier above had been cranked up to act as a surgical light, and the morbid translucence they brought to her skin made me shiver. It was as if the lightning had vaporized all the blood in her body. Strangely though, there were no burns. I leant forward to get a better look, and something grabbed my jacket. Sarah's hand clutched the fabric with white-knuckle ferocity. I yelled and ripped free, stumbling as I did so. Sarah sat up, and everyone in the room took several steps back. Robert pushed Martha behind him and kept his eyes on the woman who had been dead seconds ago. Sarah's eyes roved over the room, back and forth, from face to face. There was no recognition in them. Instead, they were filled with the animalistic terror of a creature that had been cornered. Sarah, it's me, I said, my hands up. You've done enough, Cornelius said and jerked me away. Then he adopted the same placating gesture and inched towards her. Sarah's gaze jumped to Cornelius, and her brow crinkled. She slid off the table and stood, one arm outstretched towards him. Yes, Sarah, it's Cornelius, your boyfriend. You're at a hotel and you've had an accident. It's best that you lie down. she said, her voice distant, as if transmitted from another world. Mr. Regis, get away from her, Martha hissed. Cornelius ignored her and took off his white dressing gown to wrap around Sarah. The heaviness in my chest had begun to ease when I noticed something that made the nerves at the back of my head scream. The primal instinct that had been bred by millions of years of savannah predation. Cornelius wrapped his gown around Sarah, and the shadow mirrored the movement. But the shadow of the gown disappeared as its real-world counterpart draped over Sarah's shoulders. Her shadow itself was missing. Where it should have been, the floor lay unblemished by darkness. Unblemished, that is, except for a small, fleshy red mass. A mass that pulsed with a terrifyingly recognizable rhythm. "What do you mean it's a heart?" Cornelius yelled, the last word choked out like pneumonic phlegm. The young governor's son, who had been so composed throughout our stay, was now on the edge of hysterics. Kick started when I had pointed out the missing shadow. "I mean exactly that," I said, my eyes focused on Sarah. She stood by the table, Cornelius's gown wrapped around her in a haphazard manner. She trembled constantly, and every few minutes a horrific grimace would cross her face, then disappear. The worst part, though, were her eyes. They gazed at us. No, through us into something far, far beyond. "Sarah, can you hit—" "That doesn't make sense," Cornelius interrupted. I wheeled on him. He was 4 inches taller, but at this point I didn't give a damn. "Do you think I don't know that?" I shouted. "Do you think that throughout all my years in academia I failed to learn that the heart is meant to reside within the human body?" Cornelius glared at me, then averted his eyes. "It's hers?" he half asked, half mumbled. I turned back to Sarah. The dark red irregular shape that rested a meter from Sarah was not three-dimensional, and instead looked like a heart from an anatomy diagram. However, with each beat, it seemed to expand into the third dimension, then contract back into the second. It hurt my head to look at it, but at the same time, I couldn't stop. "We'll see," I said finally. I withdrew the pocket multiscope and switched it on. "Turn off all the lights." Cornelius frowned. "Why?" "Do you want to find out what's wrong with her or not?" I said. He gave me a wary look, then walked over to the switches. "Don't you dare," Martha said. Cornelius's hand froze. He looked at me, then her. Martha seized the opportunity. His profane experiments are what provoked the eye's wrath in the first place, and now he'll do it again with whatever abomination has possessed the poor child. Don't become a facilitator to his sins, or they will become yours too. "What do you suppose we do?" I spat. "Sit around and wait for her to die?" Only the supremely conceited wish to meddle with what they do not understand. I glowered at her with disgust, then turned to Cornelius. "Do it." "But," Martha screeched. Robert lumbered towards Cornelius, but it was too late. The room was drowned in complete darkness. In response, a series of horrific squelches tore through the air, like the footsteps of a nocturnal swamp monster that had finally awoke. My heart clenched, and I fumbled with the buttons of the multiscope until I found the one for the torch. I flicked it on, but nothing happened. I cursed and smacked the device again and again as the squelches grew louder. Finally, the cool white beam cut through the blackness, and I swung it in the direction of the noise. I screamed, and it was echoed by 2 others as if we were members of a demonic choir. Sarah stood wide-eyed where she'd been, but on the wall behind her, a giant monstrosity had materialized. It was an amalgamation of fleshy pink and purple sacs, crisscrossed by a network of red and white root-like structures. Each sac varied in size and texture, but all retained a vile glisten. Near its center, the deep crimson mass pulsed with a silent drumbeat that heralded madness. As I stared, entranced by the horror, Sarah clutched her face, then let out a low moan. Above her on the ceiling, 2 eyes phased into existence, the irises light blue. The multiscope trembled in my hand, and the gestalt of viscera shadowed the movement. There was a crash, then the lights flicked back on. On the floor, Cornelius lay, a hand pressed to the side of his head. Robert stood over him with a grim expression. "Her eyes," Martha said, in a grave whisper, and we all whipped around to look. Martha pointed a withered finger at Sarah, an expression of abject terror on her face. I followed her gaze and met Sarah's, though gaze could surely not be the right word. Where her eyes should have been sat dark pools of pitch that threatened to spill forth. "What is going on?" Cornelius cried. I looked away from her face, but what I spotted next was worse. The gestalt of organs, vessels, and eyes was still there, now projected on the floor by the chandelier as a life-sized anatomy diagram. There was nothing else I could think of at that point. I steeled myself, toggled the ultrasound camera mode on the multiscope, and edged forward. When I got close enough, I mashed the button to take a sonic snapshot. The eyes on the floor blinked, and I backpedaled as fast as I could. "Why are you taking pictures?" Cornelius demanded, but I ignored him. I turned on the mini display and opened the most recent image. I stared at it for a solid minute before the multiscope slipped through my fingers and clattered to the floor. I bent to pick it up, but the violent quiver of my hands prevented me from doing so. Cornelius strode over, grabbed my forearm, and hoisted me up. "What is it? What did you see?" "Nothing," I whispered. "No liver, no lungs, no heart. The lightning. Somehow the lightning displaced them all. All of them except..." His grip on my arm tightened. "Except what?" Her brain. "We have to get rid of it," Martha said in a grave voice. I went numb. "Are you saying..." "I'm saying that it needs to go," she said, her eyes ablaze. "Demon and vessel. We can't. We don't even know if the condition is terminal." "Condition? Mr. Linton, this isn't some little germ you can gawk at in your laboratory." "We don't know that," I said. "We've ran 2 tests. That's not enough to base any conclusions." "We will never reach one," Martha shouted. "It came down from the lightning and emptied her out like a butcher, without shedding a drop of blood. Whether it's to eat her, kill her, or wear her, it doesn't matter. Only the Lord can comprehend such insanities. How about if we take her to the nearest infirmary? As I said before, our ship is damaged, and even if it wasn't, I have a responsibility to protect my husband and my guests. I made a grievous mistake by letting you come here. Rest assured, there will not be another." I stared helpless, then turned to Cornelius, who had sat on the floor with his head in his hands. "You can't possibly agree with this." Cornelius glared up at me with bloodshot eyes. "She's right." A trapdoor opened beneath my stomach, and it went into freefall. "How could you Cornelius catapulted to his feet. "How could I? You're the one that got her killed," he yelled, and tears welled in his eyes. "Then all her organs got ripped out when you tried another one of your stupid experiments." He grabbed me by the collar and pulled me close. Pure venom poured from those gleaming eyes. "I bet you're enjoying this too, huh?" he seethed. "Just itching until you can put this in a paper. Tell me, are you waiting for it to take her brain before you start taking notes? Or you want another test subject first to confirm your hypothesis?" "Enough," Martha said. "Help me and Bert send it back before it's too late." Cornelius wavered, his face strained by a mixture of emotions. Then he pushed past me towards Sarah. When I reached out to grasp his arm, he spun and struck me across the jaw. I didn't have time to register the pain before my world cut to black. I woke and the room was empty. I raced to the hotel's entrance and swung the door open. There they were. Cornelius and Robert dragged Sarah by each arm, while Martha led the way to the edge of the landing yard. Sarah convulsed, and black bile shot out from her mouth, splattering the front of her crimson nightgown and pale legs. As if burnt by her own ejector, she let out a guttural scream and thrashed. Overhead, the storm clouds around the Eye of God churned like a bloodthirsty crowd in a coliseum. Martha turned back and our eyes met. "Throw it now," she shrieked. Robert and Cornelius glanced back at me. Then Robert circled over to her legs and seized them, fighting off the wild kicks as he did so. Cornelius grabbed the abandoned arm, and they carried her the last few steps to the landing yard's edge. "Stop!" I screamed and sprinted forward. I knew both of them heard me in the dead air, but only Cornelius looked at me. His face was contorted, though not with effort, and his eyes glistened in the cold light. Then he pulled his gaze away and nodded to Robert. I had almost reached them when they swung her back, then threw her forwards like a large sack of dry meal. She sailed through the air, crossing the joint boundary of the bio and art grav fields before she had begun to descend. I slipped on the ebony ooze and would have joined her if Cornelius hadn't grabbed me as I had tried to skid to a stop. Above us, Sarah soared upward, driven by inertia and no longer tied down by gravity. She spasmed, and another jet of black bile spewed from her mouth. This time, though, it didn't stop. Her jaw unhinged as gallons of the tar-like substance poured out and flowed over every inch of her skin. By the time it had stopped, she resembled a three-dimensional shadow that had been untethered from its four-dimensional counterpart. Guilt and horror consumed me as I watched her body ascend. Her unhinged jaw hung slack, and those sightless voids that had been her eyes bore into me. Behind her, the eye of God stared in ambivalence. As her body neared the lowest thunderheads, a massive bolt split the sky, and I saw a silhouette behind them. A great obscene collection of writhing limbs, tendrils, and appendages that possessed no likeness in all the kingdoms of life. Then it was gone, and so was she. I sat in the living room, wrapped in a thick blanket and shivering. I tried to fix my attention on the holographic flames of the artificial fireplace. Blue embers sprang from it and into the air before dissolving into nothingness, their lives measured in milliseconds. I attempted to count them, to figure out if there was a pattern, but it was no use. Even the most basic of mental activities was a struggle. What was I going to do when I got back? I didn't have any data or any theories. What I had seen defied logic, reason, and physics itself. There was no way I could write paper now, and even if I did, I would be laughed out of the university before they even got to the second page. Somehow, this idea did not fill me with dread as it once had. Instead, I felt a strange, melancholic relief. I realized I didn't want to write the paper. We would inform the authorities of Sarah's death due to the lightning strike, but everything else was better left buried. Otherwise, this cursed place would be a hotspot for people like me, and who knows what would happen then. Martha walked in, her face weary, but better than it had been the past few days. "Mr. Linton, your shuttle is here," she said in a cordial tone. For the first time in what felt like a year, a fleeting sense of joy fluttered through my heart. "I'll get my case," I said. "I've already packed everything." She nodded, and I got up and made my way to the door, stopping by the fireplace to absorb a bit more warmth from its hidden radiators. That was when a scream tore through the air. A barbed lance of fear pierced my stomach, and I whipped my head to Martha, whose face was twisted into a mask of terror. She was looking down at my feet. No, at the spot next to them. I followed her gaze, and my throat constricted to the point I couldn't breathe. The space where my shadow should have been was empty.